Danny Rodriguez opened his eyes to the familiar sound of his grandmother coughing in the next room. The thin walls of their apartment couldn't hide much, and that cough had been getting worse for weeks now. He rolled over and checked his phone. 5:30 a.m. Still dark outside, but he needed to get moving. The 16-year-old boy sat up on the worn couch that served as his bed and rubbed his eyes. The springs underneath had given up years ago, leaving permanent dents where he slept every night. His grandmother had the only bedroom, and he wouldn't have it any other way. She deserved whatever comfort their tiny place could offer. "Abuela, you okay in there?" He called out softly, pulling on yesterday's jeans. "I'm fine, mijo," came the weak reply, followed by another fit of coughing that said otherwise. Danny knew better than to argue. His grandmother, Rosa, had been the strongest person he'd ever known. She'd raised him alone since he was 7, after his mom disappeared, and his dad had never been in the picture anyway. But lately, Rosa wasn't the same woman who used to work double shifts at the laundromat just to keep food on their table. He walked to their tiny kitchen and opened the refrigerator. A half-empty bottle of milk, some leftover rice from 2 days ago, and a package of bologna that looked questionable. Danny grabbed the milk and sniffed it. Still good for another day or two. He poured what little was left into a cracked mug and heated it in their ancient microwave. The one that took 3 tries to start and made weird noises the whole time. "Here. Abuela," he said, carrying the warm milk to her bedside. "Dr. Martinez said this would help with your throat." Rosa looked up at him with those tired brown eyes that had seen too much struggle. "You're too good to me, Danny. You should be saving money for yourself, not spending it on doctor visits for an old woman." "Don't talk like that," Danny said, sitting on the edge of her bed. "We're family. That's what family does." But deep down he knew the truth was scarier than either of them wanted to admit. The medical bills were piling up faster than his paycheck could handle. Every week brought new prescriptions, new tests, new expenses that ate away at their tiny budget. He'd been doing math in his head for months now, and the numbers never worked out in their favor. After making sure his grandmother had taken her morning medication, Danny grabbed his backpack and headed for the door. The hallway of their apartment building smelled like cooking grease and cigarette smoke, same as always. Mrs. Chen from down the hall gave him a small wave as she headed out for her early shift at the factory. They nodded to each other, 2 people who understood the weight of making ends meet. The walk to school was 3 miles through neighborhoods that told the story of his city in reverse. He started in the projects where broken streetlights and boarded windows were normal, then gradually moved through areas where the houses got nicer and the cars got newer. By the time he reached Lincoln High School, he was in a completely different world. Danny's sneakers had holes that he'd covered with duct tape, but the tape was starting to peel off. Every step on wet pavement meant soggy socks for the rest of the day. He'd been wearing the same pair of shoes for almost 2 years now, and they were telling the story of every mile he'd walked in them. At school, he tried to blend in, but it wasn't easy. While other kids complained about their parents not buying them the latest phone or the newest gaming system, Danny was calculating whether he could afford lunch or if he should save that $3 for his grandmother's prescription refill. His math teacher, Mr. Williams, had pulled him aside last week with a concerned look. "Danny, you've got real talent with numbers. Have you thought about college? There are scholarships available for students like you." Students like him. Danny knew what that meant. Poor kids with potential but no resources. He'd smiled and nodded, but inside he felt that familiar ache. College felt like a dream for someone else. Someone whose biggest worry wasn't whether the electricity would stay on next month. After school ended at 3:15, Danny didn't have the luxury of hanging out with friends or joining clubs. He had exactly 27 minutes to get across town to Moretti's Diner, where he worked as a dishwasher 4 days a week and weekends. The owner, Frank Moretti, was a decent guy who paid him $8 an hour cash and sometimes let him take home leftover food. The afternoon shift at the diner was always hectic. Danny stood at the large industrial sink, scrubbing plates and pots while the restaurant hummed with activity around him. His hands stayed wrinkled and red from the hot water and harsh soap, but he didn't complain. 8 hours a week times $8 meant $64, and every single dollar mattered. "Hey, kid," Frank called over the noise of the kitchen. "You doing all right? You look tired." "I'm good, Mr. Moretti," Danny replied, forcing a smile. He couldn't afford to seem unreliable, not when this job was one of the few steady things in his life. But the truth was, he was exhausted. Between school, work, and taking care of his grandmother, sleep had become a luxury he rarely enjoyed. Most nights he stayed up late helping Rosa with basic tasks that used to be easy for her, organizing her medications, helping her to the bathroom, sometimes just sitting with her when the pain kept her awake. As he worked, Danny's mind wandered to the bills stacked on their kitchen counter. The rent notice that said they were 2 months behind, the letter from the hospital about his grandmother's unpaid medical bills, the disconnection warning from the power company. Each piece of paper represented a problem he didn't know how to solve. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from Rosa asking him to pick up her heart medication on the way home. Danny's stomach dropped. He'd been hoping they could wait until Friday when he got paid again, but his grandmother couldn't skip doses. That meant using the last $23 in his wallet, the money he'd been saving for groceries. When his shift ended at 8 o'clock, Danny's back ached and his feet were sore, but he forced himself to keep moving. The pharmacy was 6 blocks in the wrong direction, but Rosa needed her medication. As he walked through the cold night air, Danny found himself wondering how much longer he could keep this up. Other kids his age were worried about homework and weekend plans. Danny was trying to figure out how to keep his family from becoming homeless while maintaining grades good enough to maybe, possibly, somehow find a way to a better future. Some nights, lying on that broken couch, he wondered if he was fighting a battle he couldn't win. But then he'd hear his grandmother's voice calling him Mijo with so much love. Or he'd remember Mr. Williams saying he had talent, and Danny would find the strength to keep going. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but it might also bring new opportunities. In a life where hope was sometimes the only currency that mattered, Danny had learned to hold on to it tightly. He just didn't know that in less than 24 hours, everything would change in ways he could never imagine. Thursday evening brought the kind of rain that soaks through everything. Danny pulled his thin jacket tighter as he stepped out of Moretti's diner, the warm kitchen air replaced by the cold October night. His shift had run late because of a large group that came in just before closing, which meant extra dishes but also an extra $10 in his pocket. Every bit helped. The walk home always took him through the Riverside district where the houses got bigger and the streetlights actually worked. It wasn't the shortest route, but it was the safest, especially this late at night. Danny kept his head down, focusing on avoiding the puddles that reflected the fancy store windows and luxury cars parked along the curb. He was thinking about his grandmother's doctor appointment tomorrow when he heard the screeching sound, tires on wet pavement, the kind of noise that makes your stomach drop because you know it means trouble. Then came the crash, metal against wood, glass breaking, and finally the hiss of steam rising from hot metal meeting cold rain. Danny's first instinct was to keep walking. This wasn't his neighborhood, these weren't his people, and getting involved in other people's problems never ended well for someone like him. But then he heard something that stopped him cold, a woman's voice, weak and scared, calling for help. He turned toward the sound and saw it. A dark blue sedan, expensive looking, wrapped around the thick trunk of an old oak tree. The front end was completely smashed, steam pouring from under the crumpled hood. The driver's side was pressed against the tree, but he could see someone moving in the passenger seat. Danny ran toward the car, his worn sneakers splashing through puddles. As he got closer, the situation looked worse. The woman inside was maybe 50 years old, well-dressed in clothes that probably cost more than Danny made in a month. Blood was running down the side of her face from a cut on her forehead, and she seemed confused, trying to unbuckle her seatbelt with shaking hands. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Danny called through the passenger window, which had spiderweb cracks running through it. She looked at him with unfocused eyes. I can't. The door won't open. There's smoke." Danny looked toward the front of the car and felt his heart race. What he'd thought was steam was actually smoke, and it was getting thicker. He could smell something burning, not just oil or coolant, but something that made him think of danger. He tried the passenger door handle, but it was jammed tight. The frame was bent from the impact, trapping the woman inside. Danny looked around desperately for help, but the street was empty. Most people in this neighborhood were already home, safe and warm, probably not even aware of what was happening outside their windows. The smoke was getting darker now, and Danny could see a small orange glow starting to flicker under the hood. His hands were shaking as he realized what was about to happen. He'd seen enough movies to know that cars could catch fire, and when they did, anyone inside was in serious trouble. "Listen to me," Danny said, pressing his face close to the cracked window. "I'm going to get you out of there, okay?" "What's your name?" "Catherine," the woman whispered. "Catherine Blackwood. Please, I have children." Something in her voice, the fear and desperation, made Danny's decision for him. He looked around and spotted a chunk of broken concrete near the sidewalk, probably left over from some construction work. It was heavy enough to hurt his back as he lifted it, but he managed to carry it back to the car. "Catherine, I need you to cover your face and lean away from this window, okay? I'm going to break the glass." She nodded weakly, using her arms to shield herself as best she could. Danny took a deep breath, said a quick prayer, and swung the concrete chunk at the passenger window. The first hit made a bigger spider web but didn't break through. The second hit punched a hole, and the third shattered the window completely. Glass fell everywhere, including on Danny's hands as he cleared the opening. He could feel cuts opening up on his palms and fingers, but the adrenaline kept him moving. The fire under the hood was getting bigger, and he could hear crackling sounds that meant they didn't have much time. "Give me your hands," Danny said, reaching through the broken window. Catherine was barely conscious now. Whether from the head injury or shock, he couldn't tell. She was heavier than he'd expected, and getting her through the window opening while avoiding the worst of the broken glass was like solving a puzzle under pressure. His work shirt got torn as he maneuvered her upper body through the window, and he felt more glass cutting into his arms, but he kept pulling. Catherine's expensive dress got shredded, but that didn't matter now. What mattered was the growing heat he could feel coming from the front of the car, and the way the orange glow was getting brighter. Finally, he got her clear of the car and carried her about 20 feet away to the sidewalk. That's when his legs gave out and they both collapsed onto the wet concrete. Catherine was breathing but unconscious, blood still trickling from the cut on her head and several smaller cuts from the glass. Danny fumbled for his phone with hands that were now clearly torn up and bleeding. His battery was down to 2%. He'd forgotten to charge it again, but it was enough to call 911. 911, what's your emergency? There's been a car accident on Maple Street near the big oak tree. A woman is hurt and the car is on fire. We need an ambulance and fire department right now. As he hung up, Danny looked back at the car and his blood went cold. Flames were now visible through the broken windshield, and smoke was pouring out of every opening. If he had waited even 2 more minutes to make that decision, Catherine Blackwood would have died in that car. He used his torn work shirt to press against the worst of Catherine's head wound, trying to remember anything useful from health class about treating injuries. She was starting to come around, her eyes fluttering open. "What? What happened?" she whispered. "You crashed your car, but you're safe now," Danny said. "Help is coming." In the distance, he could hear sirens approaching. The fire was really going now, flames shooting up from under the hood and starting to spread to the interior. Danny realized he was shivering, partly from the cold rain and partly from the shock of what had just happened. Catherine grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "You saved my life," she said, her voice clearer now. "What's your name?" "Danny Rodriguez," he said. "But don't worry about that now. Just stay awake until the paramedics get here." The ambulance arrived first, followed quickly by 2 fire trucks. As the EMTs took over Catherine's care, Danny tried to step back, but one of them noticed his bleeding hands. "Son, you need medical attention too," the paramedic said. Those cuts looked deep. The next few hours were a blur of questions, bandages, and paperwork at the hospital. Danny kept thinking about his grandmother, who would be worried sick, and his job, which he'd probably lose for missing tomorrow's shift. As he sat in the emergency room getting stitches in his hands, he wondered if doing the right thing had just made his already difficult life impossible. He had no idea that saving Catherine Blackwood's life would change everything. Danny woke up to the worst pain he'd felt in his 16 years. His hands were wrapped in thick white bandages that made them look like baseball mitts, and every finger throbbed like it had its own heartbeat. The hospital clock had read 2:47 a.m. when they'd finally finished stitching him up and let him go home, which meant he'd gotten maybe 3 hours of sleep on the broken couch. But the physical pain wasn't what made his stomach drop as he stared at the water-stained ceiling. It was Friday morning, which meant he was supposed to be at Moretti's diner in 4 hours for the breakfast rush. Frank Moretti had been clear when he hired Danny. Miss a shift without calling and you're out. No exceptions, no second chances. Danny had never missed a day in 8 months of working there. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. His whole body ached from the adrenaline crash, and his bandaged hands made it impossible to push himself up normally. When he finally managed to stand, the apartment felt different somehow. Quieter. Too quiet. "Abuela?" Danny called softly, walking toward his grandmother's bedroom. "You awake?" No answer. He pushed the door open and found Rosa lying in bed, but something was wrong. Her breathing was shallow and raspy, worse than it had been in weeks. Her face looked gray in the morning light coming through their thin curtains, and when Danny touched her forehead, she felt burning hot. "Abuela, wake up," he said, gently shaking her shoulder with his wrist since his hands were useless. "Rosa, come on, open your eyes." She stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering but not opening. This wasn't the normal tiredness he'd gotten used to. This was something worse, something that made his chest tight with panic. Danny's phone was down to 15% battery. He'd forgotten to plug it in when he got home from the hospital. With his bandaged hands, it took 3 tries to dial Dr. Martinez's office. And when he finally got through, the receptionist's news hit him like a punch to the gut. "I'm sorry, but Mrs. Rodriguez's file shows outstanding balances on her account. Dr. Martinez can't see her until payment arrangements are made for the previous visits." "But she's really sick," Danny said, his voice cracking. "She has a fever and she won't wake up properly. This is an emergency. You'll need to take her to the emergency room if it's urgent. But I have to tell you that the hospital has also noted collection issues on her account." Danny hung up and stared at his grandmother's pale face. The emergency room meant another bill they couldn't pay. But leaving her like this wasn't an option. He managed to call 911 with his knuckles, and 20 minutes later, paramedics were carrying Rosa down the narrow apartment stairs on a stretcher. At the hospital, Danny sat in the waiting room for 3 hours before a doctor came out to talk to him. Dr. Kim looked tired, like someone who'd delivered too much bad news in one shift. "Your grandmother has pneumonia," she said, sitting down across from Danny. "It's progressed pretty far, which is why she was so unresponsive this morning. We've got her on antibiotics and oxygen, but she needs to stay here for several days, maybe a week." Danny felt relief wash over him, followed immediately by dread. "How much will that cost?" Dr. Kim glanced at her clipboard. "I need to be honest with you, Danny. The billing department has flagged your grandmother's account. There are unpaid bills going back 4 months. They're talking about requiring payment up front for any non-emergency treatment." "But this is an emergency, right?" Danny asked, even though he could see the answer in the doctor's expression. "We'll treat her pneumonia because it's life-threatening. But once she's stable..." Dr. Kim let the sentence hang in the air. "I'm sorry. I wish I had better news." Danny left the hospital feeling like the world was closing in around him. His phone kept buzzing with calls from Moretti's diner. But what was he supposed to tell Frank? That he'd destroyed his hands saving some rich lady and now couldn't wash dishes? That he'd been at the hospital all morning and couldn't make it to work? By the time he finally answered, Frank's voice was cold with disappointment. "Kid, I liked you, I really did. But I can't run a business with people who don't show up. Clean out your locker when you get a chance." Just like that, Danny's $64 a week was gone. He stood outside the hospital entrance watching people walk by with their normal problems and normal lives, and felt completely alone. His bandaged hands made it impossible to do most jobs, even if he could find someone willing to hire him on the spot. The walk home took forever because every step reminded him of how stupid he'd been the night before. While he was playing hero, his own family was falling apart. What had he been thinking? That saving some stranger would somehow make his life better? All he'd done was make everything worse. Back at the apartment, Danny opened the kitchen drawer where they kept their money, a mix of crumpled bills and loose change that represented their entire financial world. $47.16. That was it. That was all they had left between them and the street. The eviction notice was still taped to their door, along with a new one that gave them 72 hours to pay or get out. The electricity bill had a bright red final notice stamp across the top. Rosa's medication bottles sat on the counter, half of them empty with no money to refill them. Danny tried to think of options, but every door seemed closed. His school guidance counselor was always talking about scholarships and opportunities, but those were for kids who could afford to wait for the future. Danny needed money today, this week, or he and his grandmother would be homeless. He spent the afternoon walking through every business in a 6-block radius, asking if they needed help. His bandaged hands made him look like trouble, and most managers took one look and said they weren't hiring. The few who listened to his story gave him pity smiles and promises to keep his resume on file. By evening, Danny was exhausted and defeated. He sat on the steps outside the apartment building, watching kids from his school drive by in their parents' cars, heading to jobs they didn't desperately need or homes where the lights would definitely stay on tonight. Mrs. Chen from down the hall found him there an hour later, staring at nothing. "You okay, mijo?" she asked, sitting down beside him despite her own long day at the factory. Danny almost laughed at the question. Okay? His grandmother was in the hospital with bills they couldn't pay. He'd lost his job trying to help a stranger. They had less than $50 and were about to be evicted. His hands were so torn up he couldn't work even if someone would hire him. "Yeah," he said instead. "Just tired." Mrs. Chen nodded like she understood. In this neighborhood, everyone was tired in ways that sleep couldn't fix. As the sun went down, Danny realized he'd been so focused on surviving day to day that he'd never really thought about what would happen when surviving wasn't enough anymore. Tomorrow he'd have to figure out how to keep them from losing everything. He had no way of knowing that tomorrow would bring visitors who would change everything about his life. Sometimes the universe works in ways that make no sense until you can see the bigger picture. And Danny's picture was about to become something he could never have imagined. Danny had been sitting on the hospital floor for 2 hours, his back against the cold wall, when the call came. The voice on the other end was professional but firm. His grandmother's insurance had been suspended due to non-payment, and they needed to discuss payment arrangements before she could receive any more treatment beyond basic emergency care. He hung up and put his head in his bandaged hands. Rosa was stable now, but the doctors wanted to keep her for observation. Every hour she stayed meant more money they didn't have. Every breath she took in that hospital bed was adding to a bill that would probably follow them for the rest of their lives. The walk back to the apartment felt like walking to his own execution. Danny had spent the morning going door to door again, this time in the nicer neighborhoods asking if anyone needed yard work or odd jobs. The bandages made him look suspicious, and most people wouldn't even open their doors wide enough to hear his full sentence. When he turned onto his street, Danny stopped walking. 3 black SUVs were parked outside his building, the kind of vehicles he'd only seen in movies. They looked completely out of place among the beat-up cars and empty parking spaces that usually lined the curb. His first thought was police, maybe immigration, or worse. In his neighborhood, fancy government cars usually meant somebody was in serious trouble. Danny's heart started racing as he wondered if somehow the accident the night before had gotten him into legal problems he couldn't afford to handle. But as he got closer, he realized these weren't government vehicles. They were too clean, too expensive. The windows were tinted dark enough that he couldn't see inside, but he could tell people were moving around. One of the rear doors opened and a man in a perfectly fitted suit stepped out. Danny had never seen clothes that expensive in person. The man's shoes probably cost more than Danny's family spent on groceries in 3 months. He was tall, maybe 50 years old, with gray hair and the kind of confident posture that comes from never having to worry about money. Behind him, 2 more people got out of the SUVs. A woman with a briefcase who looked like she meant business, and a younger man who was definitely some kind of security. Danny could tell by the way he stood and how his eyes kept scanning the street. The older man walked directly toward Danny, which made no sense at all. Rich people in $1,000 suits didn't walk up to broke teenagers in torn jeans and bandaged hands. "This had to be some kind of mistake. Are you Daniel Rodriguez?" the man asked, his voice carrying just a hint of an accent that Danny couldn't place. "Depends who's asking," Danny replied, suddenly aware of how he must look after 2 days of no sleep and wearing the same clothes he'd had on during the accident. The man smiled, and something about it made Danny feel less scared. "My name is Harrison Blackwood. I believe you saved my wife's life 2 nights ago." Danny's world tilted sideways. Harrison Blackwood. He'd heard that name before, seen it on magazine covers at the grocery store checkout line. Tech billionaire, one of the richest men in the country, the guy who'd invented something that changed how the internet worked. And his wife was Catherine, the woman Danny had pulled from the burning car. "Is she okay?" Danny asked, forgetting everything else for a moment. "Catherine, I mean Mrs. Blackwood, is she going to be all right?" Harrison's smile got wider. "She's going to make a complete recovery thanks to you." The doctor said if you'd been even a few minutes later. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. That's good, Danny said, and meant it. I'm glad she's okay. Danny, can we talk? Privately? Harrison gestured toward the building entrance. There are some things I need to tell you. Things that are going to be hard to believe. They ended up in Danny's tiny apartment, which had never felt smaller than it did with Harrison Blackwood standing in the middle of it. The billionaire looked around at the cracked walls and worn furniture without any judgment in his expression, just sadness. Before we go any further, Harrison said, I need to ask you about your father. What do you know about him? Danny felt his stomach twist. Nothing, really. He left before I was born. My grandmother doesn't like talking about him. She just says he made bad choices and got mixed up with the wrong people. Harrison pulled out his phone and showed Danny a picture. Two young men, maybe 20 years old, standing in front of a garage with computer parts scattered on tables behind them. One of them looked like Danny might look in a few years, and same dark hair, same eyes, same stubborn jawline. This is your father, Antonio Rodriguez, Harrison said quietly, and that's me about 30 years ago. We were best friends, business partners, and roommates. We started our first company in that garage. Danny stared at the photo, trying to process what he was hearing. His father, the man who'd abandoned him and his grandmother, had been friends with one of the most successful people in the world. That's impossible, Danny said. My dad was a nobody. He ran off and left us with nothing. Harrison sat down on the edge of the broken couch, which creaked under his weight. Your father was brilliant, Danny, smarter than me in a lot of ways. He came up with half the ideas that made our first software successful. But he was also scared. Scared of what? Of success. Of responsibility. Of becoming someone different than who he thought he was. Harrison's voice got softer. When your mother told him she was pregnant, Antonio panicked. He thought he wasn't ready to be a father, wasn't good enough to raise a child. So he made a choice that haunts me to this day. Danny felt like he was listening to someone else's story. What choice? He sold me his half of the company for $10,000 and disappeared. Said he needed to start over somewhere else. Become someone better before he could be part of your life. I tried to talk him out of it, but Antonio was stubborn. Just like someone else I know. The room went completely quiet except for the sound of traffic outside. Danny's mind was racing, trying to understand what this meant. $10,000, he repeated slowly. Harrison nodded. Those shares he sold me for $10,000 would be worth about $200 million today. Danny felt like someone had hit him in the chest with a baseball bat. $200 million. His father had walked away from $200 million because he was scared of being a dad. But here's what your father never knew, Harrison continued, his voice gentle but firm. I've been looking for you and your grandmother for 15 years. I wanted to honor Antonio's contribution to our success. I wanted to make sure his family was taken care of. You've been looking for us? Danny's voice came out as barely a whisper. Private investigators, social services, school records, we tried everything. But you'd moved several times and your grandmother was careful about keeping a low profile. We could never quite catch up to where you were living. Danny thought about all the times they'd moved, usually because of rent they couldn't pay or landlords who didn't like tenants who fell behind. His grandmother had always paid in cash when possible, always avoided drawing attention. She'd been protecting them, but she'd also been hiding them. Then 2 nights ago, Harrison said, Catherine called me from the hospital. She told me about a teenage boy named Danny Rodriguez who'd saved her life. It took my people about 6 hours to confirm that you were Antonio's son. The weight of everything hit Danny all at once. His father hadn't just abandoned them, he'd given up a fortune. But he'd also made it possible for Danny to exist, to be raised by Rosa, to become the kind of person who would risk his life to save a stranger. What happens now? Danny asked, afraid to hope but unable to stop himself. Harrison smiled, and Danny could see traces of the young man from the photograph. Now we make sure Antonio's son gets everything his father should have given him. Danny stared at Harrison Blackwood, trying to process words that seemed too big for his tiny apartment. Everything his father should have given him. What did that even mean? His mind was still spinning from learning that his absent father had been business partners with one of the richest people in the world. I know this is overwhelming, Harrison said gently, pulling out his phone, but right now we need to take care of the immediate problems. Your grandmother needs proper medical care, and you shouldn't have to choose between her health and keeping a roof over your heads. Before Danny could respond, Harrison was making a call. "Jennifer, it's me. I need you to contact St. Mary's Hospital immediately. There's a patient named Rosa Rodriguez in room 237. I want all her medical bills transferred to our corporate account, and I want her to receive whatever treatment the doctors recommend. No restrictions." Danny felt his legs go weak. "Mr. Blackwood, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," Harrison said firmly, still speaking into the phone. "Also, there are some outstanding rent and utility bills that need to be handled. Send someone to 412 Maple Street, apartment 3B. Clear everything." He hung up and turned back to Danny. "Your grandmother raised an incredible young man. The least I can do is make sure she gets the care she deserves." Within an hour, Danny's phone was ringing with calls he'd never expected to receive. The hospital billing department, apologizing for the confusion and assuring him that his grandmother's treatment would continue without interruption. The apartment management office confirming that his rent was current and there would be no eviction proceedings. The utility company, informing him that his services had been restored and his account had a positive balance. But Harrison wasn't finished. "Danny, I want you to come with me to see your grandmother. There are things I need to tell her and things she needs to tell you." The ride to the hospital in Harrison's SUV felt like traveling to another planet. The leather seats were softer than Danny's bed, and the car was so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat. Harrison spent the drive talking about Danny's father, filling in pieces of a puzzle Danny had never known existed. "Antonio was the creative one," Harrison said as they drove through the city. "I was better with business stuff, but your dad could see solutions that nobody else could imagine. He used to stay up all night coding, surviving on coffee and determination. When we got our first big contract, he was so excited he called me at 3 a.m. just to share the good news." "What happened to him?" Danny asked. "I mean, after he left," Harrison's expression grew sad. "He sent me one letter about 6 months after he disappeared. Said he was working construction in Arizona, trying to become the kind of man who deserved to have a family. He promised he'd come back when he was ready, when he could provide for you and your mother properly. But he never did. No, he never did. I hired investigators to find him after we started making real money. But Antonio had gotten good at staying invisible. We found records of him working different jobs across the Southwest, but he was always one step ahead of us. Then about 10 years ago, the trail went cold completely. At the hospital, Danny found his grandmother sitting up in bed, looking better than she had in weeks. The oxygen tube was gone and there was color in her cheeks again. When she saw Harrison walk in behind Danny, her face went completely white. "Dios mío," she whispered. "Harry, is that really you?" Danny looked back and forth between them in confusion. "You two know each other?" Rosa's eyes filled with tears. "Mijo, this is Harrison, your father's best friend. I haven't seen him since you were a baby." The next hour was filled with revelations that changed everything Danny thought he knew about his family's history. His grandmother told him about the early days, when Antonio and Harrison were building their company and dreaming of changing the world. She'd watched them work 18-hour days, seen their first successful product launch, witnessed their friendship that seemed unbreakable. "Your father loved you before you were even born," Rosa said, holding Danny's bandaged hand, "but he was terrified of failing you the way his own father had failed him. Antonio's dad was an alcoholic who lost job after job, and Antonio was convinced he'd inherited some kind of curse." "That's not true," Harrison said firmly. "Antonio was nothing like his father. He was responsible, brilliant, and more loyal than anyone I've ever known. But he couldn't see it in himself." Rosa nodded sadly. "When the company started making real money, Antonio panicked. He said he didn't deserve success, that he'd find a way to ruin it and hurt everyone he cared about. So he ran." Danny felt anger building in his chest. "He left us with nothing. We've been struggling for years while he was out there feeling sorry for himself." "No, mijo," Rosa said gently. "He left us with you, and you turned out to be worth more than any amount of money." Harrison leaned forward in his chair. "Your grandmother is right, Danny. What you did 2 nights ago, saving Catherine without thinking about the cost to yourself, that's exactly the kind of person your father was deep down. He would have been so proud." Over the next few days, Danny's world transformed in ways he could never have imagined. Harrison didn't just pay their bills. He made sure Danny and his grandmother were set up for life. A trust fund was established that would cover Rosa's medical care for as long as she needed it, along with enough money to move to a better apartment and live comfortably. But the biggest changes were yet to come. Harrison offered Danny something that seemed impossible, a full scholarship to any university he wanted to attend, with all expenses paid. Not just tuition, but housing, food, books, everything. And after graduation, a guaranteed position at Blackwood Industries, starting in whatever department interested him most. "Your father's shares in our original company," Harrison explained. "I've held them in trust all these years, hoping he'd come back to claim them. Now they belong to you, not the full $200 million. That wouldn't be fair to our other shareholders, but enough to ensure you never have to worry about money again." Danny's head was spinning. "I don't know what to say. This doesn't feel real." "Say you'll make the most of it," Harrison replied. "Your father gave up his chance to change the world because he was afraid. Don't make the same mistake." But the most important change wasn't financial. Harrison began visiting regularly, sharing stories about Antonio and slowly becoming the father figure Danny had never had. He learned that his father had been funny, kind, and absolutely devoted to his friends. He discovered that Antonio had once driven 12 hours straight to help Harrison move, and had given his last $20 to a homeless veteran without thinking twice. "You have your father's heart," Harrison told Danny one afternoon as they sat in Rosa's new apartment, watching her teach his young daughter how to make tamales. "The difference is you're brave enough to use it." 6 months later, Danny stood at his high school graduation, looking out at an audience that included his beaming grandmother and the man who had become like a father to him. His hands had healed completely, leaving only faint scars as reminders of the night that changed everything. The boy who had once walked 3 miles to school to save bus fare was heading to Stanford University in the fall, with dreams of studying engineering and maybe starting his own company someday. The teenager who had worried about keeping the lights on now had opportunities he could barely imagine. But the most important thing hadn't changed at all. Danny was still the same person who would risk everything to help a stranger, who would choose doing right over doing easy. He'd learned that heroes aren't made by the size of their bank accounts, but by the size of their hearts, and somewhere out there, maybe Antonio Rodriguez would have finally been proud of the son he'd been too afraid to raise.